At some point, your priorities changed. Not loudly, not in a way anyone immediately noticed, but internally, something became clear. You stopped trying to look right and started trying to feel right. For a long time, your image mattered, how you were perceived, how you came across, whether people understood you, whether they approved of you. So you adjusted. You softened your tone. You chose your words carefully. You held back parts of yourself that might be misunderstood, not because you were fake, but because you were aware of how easily people form opinions, how quickly they judge, how fast perception becomes reality in someone else's mind. So you managed it. You curated how you showed up. You made sure you were seen the right way. And for a while, that worked. You were liked, accepted, understood to a certain extent. But something about it never felt fully right. Because while your image was being protected, your energy wasn't. You were still drained, still overextending, still leaving interactions, feeling like you gave more than you should have. And eventually, that imbalance became impossible to ignore because no matter how well you were perceived, you didn't feel aligned within yourself. And that's when the shift began. Quietly, but powerfully, you started caring less about how things looked and more about how they felt. For a long time, you didn't realize how much energy went into being understood, not just speaking, but explaining, clarifying, smoothing things over, making sure people didn't misread you. Because somewhere along the way, you learned something subtle. If people misunderstand you, it can cost you connection. So you tried to stay ahead of that. You thought about how your words might land, how your tone might sound, how your choices might appear. You weren't pretending. You were managing perception. And that takes energy. A lot of it. Energy that most people don't even realize they're spending because it feels normal. At first, it feels responsible. It feels like emotional awareness. But over time, something starts to happen. You notice certain conversations leave you drained, not because they were intense, but because you were monitoring yourself the entire time, choosing the right response, holding back what you really felt, adjusting your reaction so things stayed smooth. And the more you did that, the more subtle tension built inside you because you were constantly prioritizing comfort for others over alignment with yourself. And most people don't notice this shift when it begins. It happens slowly. You start saying yes when you mean maybe. You start explaining when silence would be enough. You start softening truth so it's easier for someone else to accept. All small adjustments, but together, they begin to pull you away from your center, away from the version of you that feels natural, unfiltered, real. And that's where the exhaustion comes from, not from being around people, but from being around people while slightly leaving yourself behind. That's the hidden cost of protecting your image. You stay liked, but you slowly become tired because your energy is being spent maintaining something that isn't fully honest, not dishonest in words, but in alignment. You're present, but not fully expressed, kind, but slightly restrained, understanding, but quietly overextending. And eventually, your body begins to notice it before your mind does. You start feeling drained. After certain interactions, you feel tension in conversations that once felt normal. You notice yourself needing more space, more quiet, more distance. At first, you might think, maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I'm becoming less social. Maybe something is wrong with me. But nothing is wrong. What's actually happening is awareness is starting to grow. You're beginning to notice where your energy goes, who it flows toward, and how much of it you've been giving away just to maintain how things look. And once you notice that, something inside you starts changing. You stop asking, how will this make me look? And start asking, how will this make me feel? That question alone begins shifting everything. Because image lives outside you, but energy lives inside you. And once you start protecting that, your priorities naturally begin to change. There isn't a single moment where everything changes. It's not one conversation, not one realization, not one decision that suddenly frees you from needing approval. It happens slowly, quietly, through accumulation. Moments where you notice how something felt instead of how it looked. Moments where you walked away from an interaction and instead of thinking, they liked me, you thought, that didn't feel right. And that thought lingers because for a long time, your internal measure was external. Did they understand me? Did they approve? Did I handle that well? Did I come across the way I wanted to? Those questions guided your behavior. They shaped your responses. They influenced how much of yourself you revealed and how much you held back. But now, a different awareness begins to form. You start noticing your own experience in real time, not just what's being said, but how your body responds. While it's being said, the slight tension in your chest, the hesitation before you speak, the moment you feel yourself about to overexplain, the urge to soften something that is actually true. Those moments become visible to you. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. You begin catching yourself mid-adjustment, mid-performance, mid-compromise. And in that awareness, something subtle shifts. You pause, not long, just enough to ask yourself a different question. Is this honest? Not. Is this acceptable? Not. Will this be received well? But is this honest? For me, that question changes your response. Sometimes, in small ways, you say less. Instead of over-explaining, you allow silence. Instead of filling the space, to keep things comfortable, you let your tone stay neutral. Instead of shaping it to be more agreeable. Other times, the shift is more noticeable. You say no without cushioning it. In long justifications, you express something real, even if it might not be fully understood. You choose not to engage in conversations that drain you, even if it makes you seem distant. And at first, these changes can feel unfamiliar because you're not used to prioritizing how you feel over how you're perceived. There may even be a moment of discomfort, a quiet voice that says, was that too much? Did I come across wrong? Should I have handled that differently? Because the part of you that was trained to seek approval doesn't disappear overnight, but something else starts becoming stronger. The part of you that values alignment, the part of you that recognizes how much energy it takes to constantly manage how you're seen. And slowly, that awareness begins outweighing the need for approval because you start noticing the difference in how you feel when you adjust yourself to be liked. There's a subtle heaviness, a lingering tension, a quiet sense that something wasn't fully expressed. But when you respond from honesty, even if it's simple, even if it's quiet, there's a lightness, a sense of internal clarity, a feeling that you didn't leave yourself behind in that moment. And that feeling becomes more valuable than approval because approval is temporary. It depends on who you're with, what they believe, how they interpret you. It changes. But alignment is stable. It stays with you after the conversation ends, after the interaction is over, after you're alone again with your thoughts. It shows up as peace, as calm, as a lack of mental replay, because you're no longer questioning yourself. You're no longer wondering if you should have said more or less, or something different. You simply feel settled. And once you experience that kind of internal peace, you begin protecting it, not aggressively, not defensively, but intentionally. You become more selective with where your energy goes, more aware of who drains it and who respects it, more honest about what you can and cannot give. You stop overextending just to maintain a certain image. You stop performing just to keep things smooth. You stop carrying the emotional weight of how you're perceived, and instead, you begin standing in something much more grounded. Your truth, not a loud version of it, not a confrontational version, just a steady, consistent, honest version. And from that place, approval loses its power over you because you no longer need external validation to confirm what you already feel. Internally, you know when something aligns, you know when something doesn't, and that knowing becomes your guide. At some point, you stop performing, not in a dramatic way, not with an announcement, but in small, quiet moments where you choose not to adjust. For a long time, performance didn't feel like performance. It felt like being considerate, like being emotionally aware, like knowing how to navigate people in a way that kept things smooth. And in many ways, it came from a good place. You knew how to read a room. You knew how to sense what someone needed. You knew how to respond in a way that avoided tension. But over time, that awareness slowly turned into self-editing. You began filtering yourself before you even spoke. You began adjusting your reactions before you even felt them fully. You began shaping your presence based on what would be received well, rather than what was real. And the difficult part is, this kind of performance is often rewarded. People feel comfortable around you. Conversations stay easy. You avoid conflict. You become someone others describe as easy to be with, understanding, low maintenance. But what they don't see is the internal cost of maintaining that version of you. Because while things feel easy on the surface, you are constantly regulating yourself to keep it that way, holding back reactions, adjusting your tone, managing the emotional flow of the interaction. And over time, that becomes exhausting, not because you don't care, but because you're doing more than your share of the emotional work. You are not just present, you are managing the experience. And that's when something begins to change. You start noticing how much effort it takes to maintain that version of yourself. You notice how different it feels when you don't adjust, when you speak simply, when you don't rush to fill silence, when you don't soften every truth. At first, that can feel uncomfortable because you're stepping out of a role you've been playing for a long time, a role that kept things smooth, predictable, controlled. But something else starts to happen. You begin to feel more like yourself, less monitored, less filtered, less divided internally, because you're no longer splitting your attention between being present and managing how you're perceived. You're just there, fully. And that presence has a different quality. It's calmer, more grounded, more honest. You're not trying to create a certain impression. You're allowing your presence to speak for itself. And this is where something important shifts in your relationships. Because when you stop performing, people respond differently. Some feel it immediately, They notice the change, the lack of over-explaining, the absence of emotional overgiving, the way you no longer carry the entire interaction. And for some people, that can feel unfamiliar because they were used to you doing more accommodating, more smoothing, more adjusting. So when that effort is no longer there, the dynamic changes, not because you became distant, but because you became balanced. You are no longer overcompensating to keep things comfortable. You are meeting people where they meet you, no more, no less. And that balance reveals a lot. It shows you who is willing to meet you in that space, who can engage without you carrying the emotional weight, who respects your energy without needing you to manage theirs. And it also reveals who relied on your performance to keep the connection working, who expected you to adjust, to accommodate, to make things easier for them. And once you see that, you stop feeling responsible for maintaining dynamics that require you to leave yourself behind. You begin choosing connections that feel mutual, natural, unforced, because when you show up as your real self, the right connections don't require performance. They respond to your presence, not your effort, to be perceived a certain way. And that realization is what makes authenticity feel safer than approval, because approval often asks you to adjust, but authenticity allows you to stay in your truth, stay in your energy, stay in yourself. And once you experience that kind of alignment, you no longer want to go back to performing for connection. The final shift isn't loud. It doesn't need to be announced. It shows up in how you move, in what you allow, in what you no longer explain. Because at some point, being liked stops feeling as important as being at peace. For a long time, those two things felt connected. If people liked you, things felt easier, smoother, more secure. So you maintained that. You adjusted where needed. You softened where necessary. You stayed agreeable, even when something didn't fully sit right, because being liked felt like safety. But now, you see something you didn't see before. Being liked doesn't always mean being respected. It doesn't always mean being understood. And it definitely doesn't always mean being aligned. You can be liked and still feel drained. You can be liked and still feel unseen. You can be liked and still feel like you're carrying more than you should. And once you experience that, the value of approval starts to change, not because you reject it, but because you no longer depend on it. You begin choosing something deeper, something quieter, something far more stable. Inner alignment, the feeling that who you are externally matches what you feel internally. No tension, no performance, no quiet self-betrayal. To keep things comfortable. And that alignment becomes your new standard. Not perfection, not control, just honesty. Honesty in how you respond. Honesty in what you give. Honesty in what you accept. And from that place, your boundaries become clearer, not sharper, in a defensive way, but steadier. You no longer feel the need to over-explain them or justify them until they're understood. You simply hold them calmly, consistently, without turning them into a negotiation, because you understand now your energy is not something to be managed by others. It's something to be protected by you. And protecting it doesn't mean shutting down. It doesn't mean becoming distant or unavailable. It means becoming intentional. Intentional with your time. Intentional with your attention. Intentional with who you allow close and how close they're allowed to be. You stop overgiving just to maintain connection. You stop over-explaining just to be understood. You stop over-adjusting, just to be accepted. And in place of all that effort, you offer something much more grounded. Presence. Real. Unfiltered. Steady presence. And the right people don't need you to do more than that. They don't need a curated version of you. They don't need you to carry the interaction. They meet you in that same space, equally, naturally, without pressure, without performance. And that's how you know you're no longer choosing based on image. You're choosing based on alignment, how something feels in your body, how it sits in your mind after it's over, whether you feel more like yourself or less. That becomes your measure, not opinions, not assumptions, not external validation. And once you live that way, you stop fearing misunderstanding. You stop needing everyone to agree with you. You stop shaping yourself to fit into spaces that require you to leave parts of yourself behind, because your priority is no longer to be seen a certain way. It's to feel right within yourself. And that feeling is not something you're willing to trade anymore. If this resonated with you, then you're already in that shift, the one where your energy matters more than your image, your alignment matters more than approval, and your peace is no longer negotiable. Stay with us, at depth of us, because this space is for women who are no longer performing to be accepted, but choosing to show up as they are and letting that be enough.